Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Tom Rich. I'm the director of the Center for Nation Spirituality and the advisor for the Boston College chapter of Alpha Sigma Nu, the honor society of the Jesuit universities. I'm delighted to be here in this special evening in which we honor the legacy and trajectory of one of our own faculty members, at which we like to call last lecture, not because it is, or we hope it's not the last lecture for him, or even strictly speaking, a formal academic lecture, but because it wants to encapsulate the best and the finest of the person that we honor this evening. To our lecturers, we ask them three simple questions. If granted the possibility to give a last lecture, what would you say? What wisdom would you impart to the world? What would you want as your legacy? As you can imagine, those simple questions require more than simple answers. They require and imply a subject who has devoted his or her entire life to the pursuit of intellectual development. A person who selflessly has committed to the core principles of Jesuit education. A person, finally, who embodies in his or her job the service to others. Today, I have the honor and privilege to introduce University historian and Clough Professor of History Emeritus, Jim O'Toole. He has been a member of BC faculty since 1998, having previously taught at UMass Boston. He has taught courses in American history, American religious history, American Catholic history, and research methods. In addition to many scholarly articles, he has published 10 books, mostly in American Catholic history, including most recently The Faithful, a history of Catholics in America, published in 2008. He has written a new history of Boston College entitled Ever to Excel, a history of Boston College, which will be available later this spring. This is a very short introduction, and I'm sure that we will learn more about him, his stories and memories at Boston College, and his scholarship during these past years in this lecture. So please join me with a round of applause to welcome Professor Jim O'Toole, the 2022 last lecture.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. This lecture was originally scheduled 2 years ago, and then something happened. I forget what that caused us to postpone it. I've been here for 2 years waiting for you to show up, so I'm glad you finally did. But I want to begin by telling you a story about an alumnus named Gene Forrester. Ever heard of him? Probably not. Gene joined the Navy after graduation, and he served in a faraway post. Then he returned to campus after about 15 years away. Coming back to the school that had meant so much to him in his younger days, he was struck immediately by how different everything looked. He recognized the old surroundings well enough, but the place seemed newer and shinier than he remembered it. Almost, he said, as if a coat of varnish had been put over everything. With the mix of pride and nostalgia that most alumni feel when they revisit their old haunts, Gene appreciated the progress, but he wasn't entirely sure that he liked this new look. He expected the school to still be as he had known it. In that deep, tacit way in which feeling becomes stronger than thought, he wrote, He preferred to imagine that the school, I'm quoting him here, came into existence the day I entered it, was vibrantly real while I was a student there, and then blinked out like a candle the day I left. His experience of the school, he was sure, had been the experience of it, the true experience of it. Gene Forrester was not a graduate of Boston College. In fact, he was not even a real person. Rather, he was the narrator and hero of John Knowles's A Separate Peace, the classic novel about boys in the prototypical New England prep school. But Gene's emotions on revisiting his alma mater would be familiar, I think, to alumni of all kinds, including graduates and future graduates of Boston College, coming back to the campus where they spent their formative young adult years, studying, playing, falling in love, preparing for the lives and careers that would fill the decades that followed. Their college, they might well think, the college of their memories, was always as it had been when they were there. It had a fixed, unchanging nature. It was real as they had known it, and anything different from that was somehow less real. Our memories are essential to our personalities and to our character. They help root us in time, and they fit the disparate pieces of our lives together into a unified and, we hope, coherent whole. Pardon my cold. This was brought home to me, this difference was brought home to me several times over the last few years as I've been writing my new history of Boston College. In several cases, my memories of things that happened during my association with the university were simply wrong. What I remembered and what the historical records showed didn't always match up. How could that be? After all, my experience of it was the experience of it, wasn't it? Well, no. But what was that experience, and what does it have to do with the larger historical arc of this institution? It gives me pause to say it because it was so long ago, but I first set foot on the campus in the fall of 1961, 60 academic years ago. Gulp. That particular, not really historic event took place when my oldest brother enrolled as a freshman. And together with others in the family, I tagged along to help move him into his dorm. I was unaware of it at the time, but studying our history more recently has shown me that this was a period of great change on campus. Change that would transform this small, local college into a national and even international university. Residence halls had been built on campus for the first time only a few years before, and the balance between resident students and commuter students began to shift. This is a subject I'll return to later on. For now, I'll tell you that Brother Bill qualified for a dorm room because, as the rules were explained to our parents, we lived far enough away that he could not be expected to commute to class every day. There was, apparently, a 40-mile radius around the campus. And if you lived within 40 miles, you were expected to commute. If you lived beyond 40 miles, you could have a spot in the dorms. We were from the town of Leominster, Massachusetts, west of Boston along Route 2, and the official ruling was that Leominster was 42 miles away, just far enough over the line to earn a place in the dorms. Now, the truth is I don't have any clear recollections of that first encounter I had with Boston College. I was still in elementary school. But as time went on, our mutual acquaintance, the campus and I, grew. First with the enrollment of another brother in 1965. I probably helped move him in too. Followed by my own arrival as a freshman in the fall of 1968. I should add here that in the meanwhile, my sister enrolled elsewhere at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. At the time, if she had wanted to come to BC, she could have been admitted only to the School of Education or Nursing. Arts and sciences and the business school were closed to her because she was a girl. Since she had no interest in becoming either a teacher or a nurse, she went happily to UMass, later earning advanced degrees at other universities and pursuing a career in medical research. Her story signifies another way I've learned in which Boston College was in the midst of change in the 1960s, moving hesitantly toward full coeducation, and to our present circumstance in which women outnumber men among our undergraduates, and for a long time now, among our alumni. I'll return to this subject too. Memories of my own years here, 1968 to 1972, are of course clearer than my earlier ones. Those years were coterminous with the presidency of W.C.B. Joyce, S.J. We were in Gasson, I point to his portrait on the wall of presidents. Clearer memories of that time come as no surprise, since those were formative years for me, as they are for most undergraduates. The memories are clearer in part because I made lifelong friends then, friends with whom I share an enduring community, whose advice I still seek, whose friendship I cherish. Our common experiences provided the basis for all that. Like my brothers, I too lived in the dorms, coming from 42 miles away, first on the upper campus, or Co-Row, as it is now called. And living 24/7 on campus had many opportunities, both ordinary and unexpected. Did I say unexpected? At the start of our junior year, for instance, there was a severe shortage of on-campus beds. More resident students had applied and had accepted admission, and this required some scrambling on the part of the institution. My roommates and I lived in a motel on Route 9, roughly where the Wegmans is today, I think, until about Thanksgiving of that year, while some temporary housing was put up to accommodate the crush. That's right, the mods. Still there, still temporary housing, half a century later. Then, when we were seniors, four of us moved to an apartment in Cleveland Circle, obviously off campus, but still very much connected to campus life. And we participated in a range of student activities. In my own case, those included student government for a while, the band, the chorale, campus ministry, and a nascent caucus of undergraduate history majors, which sought a role in departmental affairs. Very 60s. We took our studies pretty seriously, I think, and the size of the student body and of the faculty, both of them smaller than they are today, made for closer personal connections than is sometimes the case now. In addition to our formal classwork, we regularly solved the mysteries of the universe in late-night bull sessions. As we looked ahead, though we didn't phrase it this way, we were addressing a version of Michael Hymes's famous three big questions. What gave us joy? Were we any good at it? Did the world need it so that someone would pay us to do it once we had graduated? Those were turbulent years on most college campuses in America, and so it was here. But campus unrest was different at Boston College than it was elsewhere. While there certainly had been student activism over such issues as civil rights and opposition to the war in Vietnam, the spark that ignited this campus was struck by a proposed hike in the cost of tuition. Years of rapid expansion, combined with unsophisticated management, had left the institution in a very precarious financial position, as documentation in the university's archives now shows clearly. My old teacher, mentor, and later colleague and friend, Tom O'Connor, used to say that for a long time, Boston College had been run like a mom-and-pop grocery store. The money came in and the money went out, and that was pretty much that. Students paid their tuition bill in the fall and again in the spring, and this provided a seemingly steady revenue stream. If slightly less than expected came in, or you spent a little more than the budget would allow on new buildings or new programs, that was all right because more money would be coming in about 6 months. During one construction project I discovered in the course of my research on the new history, the university's accountant told the president not to worry. By the time the building has been completed, he said, the school will have received payments on tuition from students. Well, it obviously doesn't take very long for that kind of approach to get completely out of hand. It was easy to spend the same money more than once, and BC found itself in very serious debt. The numbers are hilarious when compared to the figures today. The sudden tuition increase that aroused our protest would have raised the cost of a year here from $2,000 to $2,500. Don't quote those figures to any current parents. But of course, that was a pretty big jump in percentage terms. Students went out on strike in the spring of 1970. Classes were canceled. Buildings, including this one, were taken over by sit-ins, and negotiations were held with faculty and administrators for a greater voice in university affairs. My own memories of that time merge now with what I've learned in the course of writing my new history. The strike spring was an intense, though brief, moment in the university's life. It certainly was that for those of us who lived through it. But as I can now see with the benefit of historical hindsight, it marked a turning point when a number of things came together to set the university on a new course, the course it has pursued since. Remarkably enough, the institution decided not simply to hunker down and survive, but to expand and to become something better, greater. I've mentioned a couple of these changes already. First, the shift into a residential student population. The Jesuit colleges and universities in the United States, eventually 28 of them at the high point, 27 today, these had been founded as resolutely local affairs. They were designed to serve specific local populations, focused on the cities into which Catholic immigrants had been crowding in the 19th and 20th centuries. They shared a common mission, providing education to the sons, not yet the daughters, of poor immigrant families, so they could begin to climb the economic and social ladders. Over successive generations, families could advance their fortunes, materially and in other important ways too, through education. And those benefits were available first and foremost to the people closest at hand. We can see this clearly in the case of Boston College. When classes were first offered in September of 1864, the students all walked to school from the surrounding streets of the South End neighborhood in Boston. Daniel McAvoy, whose name appears first on the enrollment register, lived 2 blocks away. Even those students who came from a greater distance were usually staying with a member of the extended family who did live nearby. John O'Shea, who enrolled in 1885, was originally from Manchester, New Hampshire. But during the school year, he boarded with an uncle who lived literally around the corner, to whom bills, etc., the dean noted carefully. The geographic circle would slowly widen after the school's move here to Chestnut Hill in 1913. The definition of local broadened, but it was still operative. In 1930, I've been able to calculate, fully 3/4 of the student body lived either in the city of Boston itself or in the near suburbs, defined for these purposes as the towns within the ring of the current Route 128 highway. 3/4. This local orientation could have a limiting effect on campus life. Students arrived every morning, whether by the Commonwealth Avenue streetcar or increasingly by carpooling in private automobiles. A significant number of students even hitchhiked, thumbing to campus every day. Think about that. Hitchhiking as a common practice has pretty much disappeared, hasn't it? Anyway, students took their classes, interrupted by lunch, and then left campus in the early afternoon, many of them for the part-time jobs that were helping to pay their tuition, leaving the campus largely empty. This often made it difficult for teams and clubs and student organizations to attract and hold members. A student poem from the 1920s, entitled After 2:30 and published in the Heights, expressed the problem. "Are you one of that herd," it asked, "that species of bird who every day gallops for home, as soon as the tower has echoed the hour that bids us leave classes and roam?" It was more to school than just classwork, the anonymous author insisted. The life of the college, the poem concluded several stanzas later, the life of the college, advancement in knowledge, in a few happy hours is obtained. Stick around some good day, just make a short stay, and see how true friendship is gained. The shift to a residential population, accomplished over the course of 2 or 3 later decades, changed all that. Students no longer had to be encouraged to stick around. They were always around. And campus life flourished, evidenced not merely in the expansion of organizations and activities that had long been common on Jesuit campuses, oratory, debate, and dramatics, musical clubs, religious and devotional societies, sports teams, but also now in groups that celebrated the increasing diversity of the student body. Regardless of race, gender, or talents, the Heights would say in the 1990s, Boston College has a club to offer. All of this was possible because of the opening of the residence halls, beginning with the Claver Loyola Xavier complex in 1955. Jesuit superiors, given their preference for localism, had at first been reluctant to give their permission for this development. "Do not seek students from other areas," one provincial said, firm in his unspoken belief that each Jesuit college had its own proper territory, that students in any given place belonged to the Jesuit college in that locality and should not be poached by colleges elsewhere. But all the Jesuit colleges had begun to compete with one another for the best students, and of course they were also competing with expanding public and private universities as well. Dorms were a key element in that competition. Today, Boston College is local no more. We receive applications from all 50 states and a host of foreign countries. Of course, there still are some students who live at home and commute to campus, whether from choice or economic necessity or other reasons, but they too share in the rich campus life that has been made possible by attracting students from all over. The decision to move toward full coeducation in all the schools of the university, which I've already referred to, was equally transformative in this period. For decades, the presumption was that a Boston College man was, well, a man. And this idea had long gone unquestioned. Even after the opening of the co-ed nursing and education schools, 1947 and 1952, respectively, there were no dormitories for women students on campus. They had to fend for themselves for housing. The institution was segregated by sex in ways that were simply taken for granted. Nursing students had represented a particular challenge in this. They took most of their classes in the building that the college owned on Newbury Street in the Back Bay, also home at the time to the law school, the School of Social Work, and what was then called the Evening College, today the Woods College. But the nurses had to come to this campus once a week to use the labs, then in Devlin Hall, for their biology and chemistry classes. Not to worry, one Jesuit reassured another. Those classes would be scheduled for the late afternoon, after 2:30, ensuring, I'm quoting him here, a minimum of contact between the boys and the nurses. With time, students themselves found ways of establishing that contact. I recall during my freshman orientation, done in those days in the week before classes began rather than over the summer as today, a group of us, all male, were sitting at lunch in the long tables in the cafeteria in McElroy. A student came along and told us that if we all sat on one side of the table, he would bring some girls otherwise excluded from the dining hall, to sit on the other side of the table and talk to us. What a thing. We were unaware of it, but there had been some earlier halting movements toward coeducation, I've since learned. 6 freshman women had been essentially smuggled into the College of Arts and Sciences in 1959. Officially admitted to the School of Education, they took all their classes in arts and sciences with the collusion of both deans. When Jesuit higher-ups off campus learned of this, they put a stop to the deception. Those women were allowed to stay, but no others could follow in their footsteps. Pressure from students and from faculty and administrators continued, however, and without asking the permission of any higher-ups, a university senate voted in 1970 to admit women to all programs of the university on an equal basis beginning that fall. Yes to girls, the not fully enlightened headline in the Heights read. Coeducation was cemented and regularized just 3 years later with the consolidation of BC and Newton College of the Sacred Heart. Newton had been founded right after the Second World War as an all-women's college, at a time when single-sex colleges were a normal feature of American higher education, particularly Catholic higher education. There were many co-ed colleges, to be sure, but the idea that women in particular might prosper in institutions that were run by and for them had wide support. At its height, enrolling about 800 students, Newton offered a very rigorous education. In the 1950s and early 1960s, its curriculum was, it seems to me, easily more demanding than that at Boston College. And it was more open to contemporary intellectual trends. The small psychology department there, for example, offered courses in depth psychology and psychoanalysis. This at a time when some in the BC Psych department were still treating psychology as a branch of philosophy. But Newton's success could not be sustained as society's attitudes changed. Co-ed universities had become the norm. Educating men and women apart from each other was suddenly harder to justify. As one formerly all-male college after another said yes to girls, enrollments at Newton fell, and the economics of the institution became unsustainable. In exchange for taking on Newton's debts, and more importantly, its students, Boston College acquired its campus, today home to our law school and to freshman residence halls. That BC was able to do so soon after nearing its own financial brink is emblematic of a momentum for change, momentum that only gathered more speed with the administrative successes in the era of Father Dalmamonen's tenure as president. Another contemporaneous change in the student body was increasing racial and ethnic diversity. Like most colleges in America, regardless of where they were, we had a long way to go in this. Some Black and Jewish students had begun to show up on campus in the 1930s, but they were clear exceptions to the usual rule, and they were not always treated fairly. The most obvious example of this is Lou Montgomery, who graduated with the class of 1941. A Black student from the city of Brockton, Massachusetts, he was the star of the football team. A running back with speed and maneuverability on the field, he helped the team claim a share in the National College Championship that year, a season that was topped by a BC victory over the University of Tennessee in the Sugar Bowl. But the ironclad rules of Jim Crow segregation at the time governed college sports no less than other aspects of life. And those rules required that teams with Black players agreed not to deploy them against all white teams from Southern schools. So when BC was informed that Montgomery would have to stay home rather than play in the bowl game, held in strictly segregated New Orleans after all, Boston College acquiesced and left him off the roster. Hardly our finest moment, passing up the chance to take a stand against racial injustice. Fortunately, things have improved since then. Hana students now constitute about 1/3 of the student body, Though, of course, this is an ongoing challenge and responsibility. What was happening through all of this was the emergence of Boston College as a recognizable modern university. You can see this in the historical sources, in the way BC people talked about the institution. Into the 1950s, everyone referred to it in shorthand as the college. By the 1960s, it's more common to hear people speak of the university. And in that usage, sometimes university was capitalized. To reflect this new reality, the trustees considered changing the name, but finally rejected the idea, probably because the most obvious alternative, Boston University, was already taken. Transition in our thinking about ourselves was not always smooth. For a time in the 1980s, the publicity people experimented with ways of explaining the distinction. Boston College ran the slogan of one marketing campaign. It's not in Boston, and it's not a college. Get it? Not in Boston, but in Chestnut Hill, not a college, but a university. Too cute, and quickly abandoned as a slogan. But it accurately described what was happening, what had happened, to the small, somewhat insular school. Committed now, not merely to passing on to new generations of students the existing body of knowledge in the various fields, the university recognized its role in adding new knowledge through the research done by faculty and students, both graduate and undergraduate. That change was clearly evident to me, the former student, when I returned to the campus to join the faculty in the fall of 1998. This was quite obviously the same place I had known, and it was just as obviously a different place. Suddenly, I knew how Jean Forrester felt. Historians like to say that our remit is to study change over time. I've tried to sketch out some of that change in this history and these memories that I've shared with you about Boston College. But what didn't change? What stayed the same, or at least adapted to the new, while retaining parts of the old? What old values persisted, finding new ways to express themselves? Values is the right word. The values here obviously derive from the Catholic and Jesuit traditions that gave birth to the school. In the past, these could largely be taken for granted, never given much explicit thought. No one had to wonder about the Jesuit identity of Boston College. You could see the Jesuit identity every day just by walking around. But as the number of Jesuits steadily declined over the years, the tending and extending of that identity required conscious attention. Many universities which began under religious auspices, starting with that place on the other side of the Charles River, abandoned or simply forgot it over time. And Boston College might well have followed that same path. But it did not. Narrow denominational thinking lost the influence it once had, but the underlying ideals and commitments endured. Now, I think you can see those commitments walking around on campus. I was floored several years ago, for instance, to discover that a student who wanted to do a service trip during spring break couldn't just go down to some office and sign up. You had to have already done a certain amount of service locally, through Pulse or for Boston or some other program, in order to qualify to work with Habitat for Humanity in West Virginia or rural Maine. Most universities these days have such programs, of course. But here they are more embedded in the larger ethos of the place. Importantly, I think, through Pulse and other efforts, they are intimately connected with the academic enterprise, prompting participants not only to do, but also to study and to reflect on their doing. The Jesuit founders of Boston College would be no doubt surprised by the new ways our traditional values are being played out, but I have to think that they would be pleased nonetheless. So there we are, the same place, a different place. There, here, I am, 60 years later, the same person, a different person. In both cases, that's as it should be. I can't tell you anything about what will happen next at Boston College. the future is, of course, beyond the historian's competence. But come back in another 60 years, some of the students here will still be around, and we'll see how things stand then. I probably won't be here to share it with you. But if we know our history, if we use our history both to confirm and to correct our memories, we'll be able to contribute to the ongoing life of this institution about which we all care so much. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And thank you for being this year the recipient of.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
So now we have a few minutes. So if anyone wants to ask a question, make a remark, or just say whatever he thinks or she thinks, so just say.
Oh, thank you. Is it on?
Yeah, it should be.
Don't know.
It's on.
Anyway, a comment and a question about the mods. And my wife and I visited my son David and the mods once and never went back. But I'm told that the 25th reunion, which is the top priority reunion, they all want to live in the mods for that reunion, which is amazing.
The mods had the virtue of novelty at the time, and I suppose they still do to some extent.
It's when it's fond memories.
Yeah.
But do I remember correctly that at a different time of overcrowding, or maybe your Route 9 time of overcrowding, we had students on the LaSalle campus?
Yes, I believe that's right. There were students on the LaSalle campus, and there were also students at Weston, the Jesuit residence and seminary at the time, and now the Jesuit retirement home. Actually, as I recall, this is a memory, not a proven historical fact that I can document. The students had to move out of the housing at Weston because the university had bought a double-decker bus to transport them back and forth, and it couldn't get under some of the bridges between Weston and here.
Well, during that LaSalle experience, students there printed shirts, which they sold, and it said, "Come to Boston College and spend freshman year abroad," which is very funny.
Not fully enlightened, like the Heights headline.
Thanks, Jim. That was terrific. Could you share with us what was perhaps the most surprising thing you came across in your researches on the history of Boston College?
That's an interesting question. I think it probably is that transition in the period immediately after the strike. For those who were here, I think especially in administration, the strike was really a formative event, and I think, personal opinion clearly labeled, I think some administrators never quite got over it. You know, there was always the possibility that now you better watch it or we'll go broke again. The thing that surprised me most was coming out of that, and the financial challenges were real. Again, the numbers are silly. Boston College faced a debt of $3 million. That's a rounding error today in the university budget. But coming out of it, we didn't just try to, we'll just, hunker back down in ourselves and be the same thing, we'll just keep doing what we've been doing. I think it was this decision to move in other directions. And the confidence with which, it seems, the people connected with the university did that. I think the other aspect to that is the decisions that the university didn't make in the aftermath of the strike and the financial crisis. There was really one of the first strategic planning efforts that was mounted after that. And there were several proposals that they considered. Well, if you're short of revenue, just expand the student body. Triple the student body and get all that tuition, and then you'll be fine. The university considered that and said, no, that's not the kind of education we want. We want education where Students, are in smaller classes rather than huge auditoriums. We want teachers who are going to engage with students in that way. We weren't going to take another path to academic distinction. I've often thought, for some universities, there's an easy way to beef up the faculty. You go out and you hire a bunch of academic stars and you keep them as far away from students as you possibly can, so they can be public intellectuals and do what they do. Again, BC decided not to do that. No, we want good scholars, we want people who are going to be distinguished in their academic fields. But we also want them to be teachers, and we want them to be teachers of undergraduates as well as graduates. So those are some of the things I think that, well, I might have had some sense of as a student. In doing the research, the importance of those issues, of those decisions, really stand out at me.
Thank you. One of the legends is that the big turning point was Doug Flutie.
Yes.
And I'd love you to comment on that, and also any, like if you made a graph and then you put the text underneath for the turning points that you thought were the most significant.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be very interested in knowing what those would be in that particular one.
Sure. I go into this in the book, and this is the part of the book that's going to get me in trouble with some readers. Because I've said this in small groups as well. If there's one thing that everybody knows about Boston College is that we were bumping along and we weren't very much, and then Doug Flutie came along and we were on television all the time, and that turned us around. That one thing that everybody knows about Boston College, and it's not true. The significant changes had already begun 10, 15 years before, including shift to residential population and coeducation. You double the applicant pool overnight, you can simply get better students than you did before. And I think those late 60s, early 1970s changes were as important, were more important, in fact, than those that were associated with football success. What I do say is that the football success of the early 1980s certainly did no harm, but they didn't make anything happen that wasn't already happening. They confirmed that shift in momentum rather than causing it in the first place. If one statistic that sticks in my mind, if you look at applications in that period, or any period I suppose, but in that period, and correlate them to football success, during at least one, and I believe two, of the prime Flutie publicity years on campus, applications for admission went down rather than up. I think that had more to do with the changing population of 18-year-olds as much as anything else. There was an earlier year in which the football team went 0-11, and applications went up. So again, I think those kinds of that kind of public visibility doesn't hurt by any means. I'm glad it happened. I'm a fan too. But it didn't make anything happen that wasn't already happening. I can write some of the reviews of the book on this score.
The college was founded in 1863 during the Civil War. The later experienced World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. I'll stop there. Do you have any reflections on the impact of war across the generations?
Yeah, we are founded, as you say, smack dab in the middle of the Civil War. But we were in Boston, far from the scene of the action, and the student body in those days was much younger. We were called a college from the very beginning, but in the early years we were really kind of an overgrown high school, and in some ways kind of a middle school as well. There were students enrolled in Boston College as young as age 9 in those years, getting just basic education. And the pattern was a student would come, get a few years of education, wouldn't necessarily stay for a degree. It was a dozen years before we had the first commencement ceremony that actually gave degrees. And the idea was a student would come, he'd get a little bit of education, so he could go out and get a little better job and help the family along, and then maybe be replaced by a younger brother who was gonna follow the same path. So the impact of the Civil War was marginal. World War I encompassed about a single academic year. Some students left, but not that many. The real impact was the Second World War, where students enlisted and were drafted after Pearl Harbor in 1941. The school did stay open. There were still students on campus, but the enrollment numbers were very small. People who had medical exemptions from the draft or something like that. And there was also cooperation with some military programs on campus. I remember the physics department offered courses in flying, which I think were probably not for the average undergraduate, but for some officer candidate who was on campus instead. So the impact on World War II was much greater. And further, the real impact of World War II was then the returning veterans. Enrollments just absolutely skyrocket in 1946. And there's a question of, well, where are we going to put them all? And that led to a kind of building boom. The construction of this building, the construction of Lyons Hall, just because there had to be classrooms, there had to be cafeterias for the student body, all made possible, of course, by the GI Bill and the return of veterans who probably wouldn't have been able to go to college, who wouldn't have thought of going to college before the war. So in war, as in other aspects, Boston College exists in a larger community, a larger context, and war is certainly a part of it.
Jim, thank you for just a wonderful, wonderful lecture. My claim to fame, I sometimes say, is that I taught Doug Flutie the Hail Mary. There's a little truth in that. I had him in both of his theology courses. And I came here in '76 and into the theology department. And at that time, and maybe this is too parochial a question to the theology department, but raging at the time was the Mary Daly controversy. And there were protests and all kinds of things, and all of which surprised me, landing on campus. Say something about that, if you have something.
Yeah, Mary Daly was a member of the theology department, came a few years before that, I think, who taught, I think initially she was an expert in some of the contemporary theologians, Paul Tillich and Aquinas. But she then was a pioneer and was one of the people who essentially invented a new academic discipline of feminist theology, which of course is common on campuses today in a very lively discipline in its own right. But at some point, she decided that to enhance the general cause, I gather, she would not allow men to take her classes. Her classes were to be for women students only. This led to ongoing fights with the dean, usually led to the cancellation of her classes, I think, though she retained her connection with the university nonetheless. The example of the theology department in that period, though, it seems to me, is a significant one. I think that the change in the curriculum that was, you could see across the board in all the academic disciplines in this period, I think it was most marked in the theology department. Into the 1960s, almost, the theology department was always one of the biggest in the university. And into the 1960s, maybe one or two of the faculty had PhDs. They were teaching on the basis of master's degrees, many of them in disciplines other than theology, but they were teaching theology because they were priests, and it was assumed that any priest could teach theology. Starting in the 1970s, the theology department, it seems to me, very deliberately changed its focus and said, if we're going to be an academic department on a par with the other academic departments of the university, we've got to have the same standards. We've got to have the same standards in hiring, in promotion and tenure, and so on. And the change in the theology department, I think, was most marked in all that, moving in the direction of the modern university. Change in the theology department was most marked because, in a way, it had the farthest to go. And that, I think, was a real success story of the department. It started with Tom O'Malley, a Jesuit, as department chair, later the Dean of Arts and Sciences as well. So, and I think that's an important part of the story.
Thank you again, Professor. I had a question. How much did to what extent was the demographic shift that went on in Boston in like the 40s, 50s, and 60s, what role did that play, if any, in BC transitioning to more of a residential college as opposed to a commuter?
Yeah, I would say there certainly was demographic change underway in Boston at the time. Early part of the 20th century, Boston, ethnically, racially, was a pretty simple place, by which I mean there weren't all that many competing groups if you compare it with other cities. But I think the other shift that was more important in that period was the rising competition from the other colleges and universities in the greater Boston area. All of which were, at the time, to some extent, doing the same thing that BC was doing. Well, this is what we used to be. Are we still going to do that, or are we going to do something else? If you look at the histories of BU, Northeastern, Tufts, all of them, it seems to me, are moving in the same direction. And so the competition among those schools for the local student population grew more intense. Even more so after, I think it's 1964, when the Boston campus of the University of Massachusetts is open, offering a public, therefore lower cost alternative to those students. So I think that rising sense of competition, I don't want to say that drove the search to go looking elsewhere, to expand the local localness of the student population. Because I think that would have happened anyway. But I think that changing climate, why is a student going to come to Boston College rather than go to BU or UMass Boston, and so on? I think those questions took on new urgency in the 1960s and after not forcing but supporting the kinds of changes that were already underway here.
If you wouldn't mind a postscript on the Mary Daly issue, I think it would bear further investigation to say, first of all, the big thing that happened in '68 when she was up for tenure for her book, The Church and the Second Sex, was, of course, Vatican II. And I think that was behind the real change in the theology department, all of that. And she was very hopeful about Vatican II, but then, of course, and at that time, the all-male student body, as I've been told, rallied around her tenure case, and there's the legend, I know it's a legend, about how they painted something in the Gaston Tower. This is totally apocryphal. Painted it red or something like that. But Bob Daly is a good source here, because we had a memorial when she died. And maybe you were there. And Judith Wilt, among other colleagues who knew her, had met her, that said the issue around whether she would admit male students to her class or not was a setup, and that she always said she would teach male students but separately. Now, that wouldn't have gone along with the Title IX rules. And here, John McDowell is a good authority on that. But that really isn't my real question. My real question is this: when you were talking about
before you get to your real question, let me say I was someone as a freshman, it must have been, who marched in favor of Mary Daly's tenure.
And she still stands as the demarcation point, basically, in feminist theology in terms of reformists and radicals and so forth. But the question I had, of course, before I arrived 22 years ago here, I taught at that other Jesuit school down the pike in Worcester. And I was always told that Holy Cross could not give degrees because of the anti-Catholic sentiment in Massachusetts, and therefore all the degrees were awarded through Georgetown at that older school. Was that similar when you were talking about you couldn't get a degree here?
Yeah, no, it's different from that, but you're exactly right. Holy Cross, which was established 20 years before BC, 1843, in the early years was not allowed by the state, couldn't get a charter from the state to grant degrees. Because in the Holy Cross rules it said we're open only to Catholics. Non-Catholics can't come to Holy Cross. The Jesuits thought they had a good reason for that, because about 15 years before Holy Cross was started, there was an anti-Catholic nativist riot that burned a convent of Ursuline sisters in Charlestown. And the Jesuit founders of Holy Cross said, we'll get the Catholics out of the city. We'll put them out in the boondocks. We'll put them on a hill in Worcester. I can say that because I'm originally from Worcester. I was born in Worcester. So as I say, Holy Cross thought they had a good reason for excluding non-Catholics, but that served as a stumbling block for the state, and it took actually until after BC got its charter in 1863, in which it said religion is not going to be a factor in who can come to BC. That then kind of retroed to Holy Cross. And you're right, in those early years at Holy Cross, graduates actually received Georgetown degrees. The same kind of thing happened for a while here in the very first graduations in the 1870s. If you look at the diplomas from that period, this might have been just a cost-saving matter. The imagery on the diploma is all Georgetown, even though it was a Boston College degree. I don't know, maybe they had a supply of them in the closet and used them up before printing their own. But that too is a measure of how, I don't know, not interconnected, but all part of the same universe the Jesuit colleges were.
And the final thing is, are you mentioning anything about how Boston College stepped into the sex abuse crisis, basically through the church in the 21st century, which was an initiative, et cetera, et cetera?
Yes, yeah, I do refer to that. I will say that the main line of the story in my history ends in 1996, which is the coming of Father Leahy as president. It seemed to me that served as a useful dividing line between the past and the present. At the same time, there is a kind of epilogue of events after 1996, including things like the sex abuse crisis, the acquisition of the Brighton property, and other things as well that I do mention, but not in the same detail that I do with the rest of the story.